The Richard Riots were an explosion of violent French-Canadian nationalism after the Protestant Anglo-Saxon president of the NHL suspended the idol of Quebecois people everywhere, Maurice the Rocket Richard. On March 13, 1955, in a game between the Boston Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens, Maurice Richard received a high stick from Bruins defenseman Hal Laycoe that left a bloody gash on his face. In a fit of rage, a well-known reaction from Richard owing to his quick temper, he attacked Laycoe with his stick, repeatedly hitting him until the stick itself broke, at which point Richard grabbed another stick and continued his assault. Linesman Cliff Thompson attempted to stop Richard's onslaught 3 times and was finally successful on the third. In response, Richard began attacking Thompson instead. Richard was ejected from the game and awaited the response on his discipline from NHL president Clarence Campbell. Campbell and Richard had had many altercations prior to this attack, and in this instance it was Campbell's desire to make an example out of Richard. He suspended Richard for the rest of the season and the playoffs. This act was a crushing blow to Canadiens fans everywhere, as the Rocket had been on pace for a scoring record that season, and the Canadiens needed his leadership if they were to continue through the playoffs successfully. Outraged at the decision, the sentiment in Quebec was mutinous. Threats were sent to Campbell's office, telling him to watch out, and much worse, to kill himself. Clearly, the people of Quebec were at the precipice of a full-on fit of rage, much like their fallen hero. On March 17, 1955, this anger came to its ultimate conclusion. The Canadiens were playing the Detroit Red Wings at the Forum, their home ice. The game lacked the usual Canadian spark, and they were down 2-1 going into the second period, with the go-ahead goal being scored just before the first period's end. Who should walk into the rink after this goal was scored? None other than the reason for the Montreal crowd's despair, Clarence Campbell. Angry at the defeated nature with which their team was playing, the crowd decided to take it out on Campbell himself. Accounts differ on what exactly occurred, but Campbell was either slapped or had 2 tomatoes shoved into his chest, which was followed by a violent altercation between 2 fans. Soon the entire crowd was in uproar and tear gas was shot into the stands. As the crowd fled to avoid the gas, they met a peaceful protest that was going on just outside the arena. When the two merged, quiet conduct was forgotten, and the mob began a violent uproar through the streets of Montreal. They smashed the windows of the Forum, then moved eastward down St. Catherine Street through Montreal's main shopping district. Smashing windows, looting, and destroying cars, the mob caused an estimated $30,000 in damages, which led to over 100 arrests. It ended the next day when Richard made a statement to the public asking them to stop the violence and rioting. Ever since, historians have looked at the riots and asked what led the people of Montreal to react so violently to the suspension, and what are the implications behind the famous Richard riots. I argue that blame cannot be laid on one single person or entity. The Richard riots were the culmination of years of perceived Protestant Anglo-Saxon repression over the Catholic French-Canadian population, personified through the debacle between Richard and Campbell. The hate mail that Campbell received, while primarily violent, pointed to his possible racist views of French Canadians. One letter said, "If Richard's name was Richardson, you would have given a different verdict." While the majority of the response over the incident was simply violent in nature, this attack should be seen as indicative of larger issues. French Canadians were tired of men like Campbell, who represented the repression they had faced for so many years. Through this attack, they were making it clear that they would no longer stand for it. If Richard stood as the ideal French Canadian, Campbell was its antithesis. Often seen giving harsher sentences to French Canadian players, it was his decision to suspend Richard that led to the uproar. He often chose to side against the French Canadians, and because of this, he too can be seen as a cause of the riot and indicative of the tensions between the two nationalities. Suspending Richard intensified the anger of the French Canadian population and made Campbell public enemy number 1 in Quebec. Finally, the press was extremely important in swaying public opinion. They published inflammatory articles and images, all depicting a hatred toward Campbell and what he represented. While they were important, they remained a cog in the larger machine. Some scholars argue it was only because of the press that the riot occurred, but this is too narrow a view of the topic. The riot occurred because the French Canadians were tired of the English elite, and they made their resentment known. The media was simply an air horn used to broadcast a sentiment that was already present. The Richard riots were a highly divisive political and social event that brought to the surface widespread beliefs and angers that had, until this point, remained just below the surface. French Canadians felt they were the oppressed regime, constantly attacked and reprimanded by the Protestant Anglo-Saxon majority present in Canada. The event was so explosive because Maurice Richard symbolized everything French Canadian. He was their hero and idol, and often spoke on the issue of racism toward French Canadians. Campbell was indicative of the English elite seeking to push out or repress the French Canadians, and his attack on Richard was seen as the catalyst for these long-held views coming to the surface. The suspension was no longer simply a suspension. It was the last straw in the abuse of power by the English-Canadian majority, the explosive beginning to the quiet revolution of the 1960s.